Okay, so let's continue here with aging and physiology for part two. Now, last time, we discussed the systolic function quite a bit, and this time we're going to talk about diastolic function. And as far as diastolic function goes, that's the portion of your cardiac cycle where your heart is relaxing and filling up with blood. So in this case, for diastolic function, usually we see a lot of stiffening that happens in the ventricle. So as far as stiffening goes, that refers to the ventricle either becoming too thick, losing some elasticity, and it just loses a lot of its ability to fill properly in order to get ready for its next contraction and allow for the systolic aspect or the blood to rush through the heart and into the body as well. As far as systolic and diastolic goes, it might be good as well here to, discuss that the systolic and diastolic aspects also refer to the pressures. So we often hear about systolic pressure, and that's part of your blood pressure, the upper value you tend to see. And for systolic pressure, it tends to be roughly around 120 to 125, or even a little bit lower than that. That could be the healthy range. We can go 110 all the way up to sometimes 130. And for the diastolic range, that's usually the bottom number. And of course, that's the pressure with which the blood hits the vessel, the wall of the vessel or the artery at the period where the heart is relaxing and filling up with blood. So for that one, we usually see numbers from 70, sometimes all the way up to 85, 86. But usually, you're not going to see as big of an increase in diastolic pressure as you would in systolic pressure. And if you tend to see drastic increases in diastolic pressure from a day-to-day assessment, that's when there could be some kind of problems going on there. So it's essentially a reflection of how easily the blood flows back into the heart in between your heartbeats. Okay, vascular stiffening of the large arteries is very common with age. So of course, this can lead to problems with pooling blood back into the atrium and the ventricle. And it can lead to something called restrictive filling. And with restrictive fillings, this prolongs the amount of time it takes to fill the ventricle, and it can lead to problems with ejection there after as well. So quite often what we see is problems with diastolic function lead to further complications with systolic function as well. If you were to take a look at this under an ultrasound, you could see something called the EA ratio. And the EA ratio, it's a wave that's detected, right, using an ultrasound, and it's essentially the relationship between the passive filling of blood into the ventricle, which leaves a larger blood volume for the atrium to eject during contraction. So then that would be that larger A wave that you see. So anyways, all in all, this is just to say that if you were to take an ultrasound of your heart and you're trying to look at diastolic function, often they use this E wave, and sometimes they'll look at it in ratio to the A wave. So that EA ratio is an important marker of diastolic function as well. Now, when we talk about left ventricular wall thickness, it's important to note, your heart has a contractile function where we see a twist occur. So often this is called your left ventricular twist, and this is really important again in order to produce that force to drive your stroke volume forward, and make sure that a proper ejection fraction is maintained and there's enough blood coming out of the heart to feed the areas of your body that need the oxygen and so forth. As you age, you end up getting too much stiffness, and that could lead to a reduction in this recoil effect. And of course, it leads to more problems, with filling up the heart with blood. And when we take a look at this in a timing parameter, this is called isovolumic relaxation time. I talk about this interval quite a bit in some of my other videos, but we see quite a few problems with IVRT as well. So, there's usually a big increase in this relaxation time. You usually want it to be anywhere from about 70, sometimes up to about 110, 105, around there. But often you could see this going up quite a bit. And especially as you age, it'll go up to those 105, 110 markers. But if you tend to see, drastic increases in this IVRT, it's also a factor that's associated with mortality as well. Okay, so, if we recall from part one, we know that as we get older, there's a giant increase in all these different inflammatory responses that tend to occur. And, inflammation, generally speaking, isn't a bad thing. In order to fight off any kind of problem or issue and try to return to a normal homeostatic balance, a key or rapid immune response is required, and that tends to be inflammatory response in this case as well. The issue is when this inflammatory response happens again and again and again, of course, as we get older and older, there is quite a bit of wear and tear that can occur. And more than that, if inflammation becomes chronic, it leads your body to be in a highly stressed or sympathetic state as well, and that could be quite damaging or difficult for the body to try and deal with all the time. Okay, so if we consider things like increase in fibroblast activity, more fibroblasts can lead to things like fibrosis. It could lead to sedimentation of different markers, which can, interfere with our conduction patterns. It can make, again, the ventricle stiff, right? So increase in fibrosis from the fibroblasts activity, an increase in excess inflammatory responses can lead to increases in cytokines. And with cytokines, again, it creates that type of environment that it can alter your heart's contractile properties and its conductive properties as well. So, if we consider more stiffness in the ventricle, more stiffness in the atrium, and a large increase in cytokines, and including potential sedimentation or deposit of these cytokines, which can further lead to more stiffness, this can really alter or throw off our sodium-potassium channels. It can throw off the conduction patterns within our heart as well. So everything like oxidative stress that's induced by excess cytokine inflammatory responses. They're independent mediators of age-related arrhythmias, so they can reduce repolarization rates, right, if we consider our action potentials. And we can also have altered late sodium currents, calcium currents, and really the whole depolarization process is altered as well. So again, we have excess oxidative stress, we have excess stiffness, we have poor contractile function, and taken together, this impairs our ventricular function as a whole, and it also completely throws off the conduction patterns from our sinoatrial node to our AV node and then down the bundle branch and so forth as well. So as we get older, because of this excess inflammatory oxidative stress and stiffness, we tend to see a high prevalence of different types of arrhythmias. And to carry on with that, your heart rate variability is one area, again, that's completely influenced, or heavily influenced, I should say, by your sympathetic or parasympathetic states. It also takes into account things like your breathing patterns, your, overall body temperature, your daily activities, your overall physiological capacity, your lung capacity, and so on. But the big thing with heart rate variability, it essentially gives you a value that's associated with how much variation there is from one heartbeat to the next. A common example here would be if your heart rate is 60 beats per minute, that doesn't mean that in that minute every beat is at 60. You could have 50, you could have 80, you could have 58, 72, and so on. But the average will end up being 60. So that's what that 60 beats per minute will refer to. With heart rate variability, generally speaking, there's certain values that you want to assess. So things like your heart rate variability standard deviation, or the deviation in beat to beat, within a certain amount of time, usually about 5 minutes. With aging, we tend to see a increase in that sympathetic shift because of the excess cytokine response, oxidative stress, and just that overall wear and tear and sympathetic drive that our body's gotten. And quite often, we see a decrease in the standard deviation of your heartbeat, so we get a decrease in heart rate variability. There's also other ways to assess the direct measurement of sympathetic and parasympathetic influence, or we call it tone in this case. And we tend to see a higher sympathetic tone as we age as well. Whether this is also due to potential conduction problems, we're not entirely sure. Usually, to measure heart rate variability, you're going to want a normal heart rhythm. We'll take a look at a few different conditions here, and you could see why you'll want a normal heart condition for heart rate variability assessments. But there's just a lot of different factors that influence your heart rate variability. So things like your blood pressure, your diastolic, systolic function, your overall stress impact or stressful state that you're currently undergoing, how much sleep you had the night before, are you working out, your body weight. All these things become really, really important when measuring heart rate variability. But generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, we tend to see a decrease in HRV as we get older. Okay, if we look here, that's a really interesting picture. We could see essentially how your ventricles expand, contract, and every time you could see the ventricles ready to squeeze and push through, it pops a valve open in order to let the blood out. Now, this heart is under, a bit of a stressed state here. So, for example, when the heart is pumping this consistently, you would assume that, hey, heart rate is quite a bit higher. Because the heart rate's higher, there's less time from one heartbeat to the next. And because of that, we tend to have a lower heart rate variability. So, these kinds of figures are really helpful in order to try and visualize how the heart is beating. When you're exercising, does it change the way it's beating? And of course it would, right? In this case, it would contract quite a bit harder. You would see a larger stretch on the ventricle wall as well. And as you're getting older, this expansion that you see on the valve, its preload state is what it's called. So when the valve is filled with blood, ready to squeeze and get the blood out into the body, we tend to see less expansion just because there's more stiffness on the wall. And because there's less expansion, that throws off that contractile function as well as we age.